I'm Dylan Radigan. I've interviewed nearly every CEO and most world leaders during the past 25 years. And now I'm bootstrapping. I'm turning my attention to the new CEOs and the irrepressible entrepreneurs leading the next generation of innovation in the world. Welcome back to Tasty Trade. I'm Dylan Radigan. Time for another episode of Bootstrapping. Our guest today, Corinne Vargas, her company Smart Charts. Corinne, I was looking at the company, and it looks like it's largely focused on translating basically undecipherable medical charts into something that can be more visually interpreted. Is that,
You got
I
it,
understand the
Dylan.
business correctly?
You've got it, Dylan, but more specifically in spaces where speech, occupational, and physical therapy are provided. So this could be everything post-stroke to a child diagnosed with autism and everything in between.
And so obviously translating things into more easily visualized data sets is obviously, in any category of life, increases the quality of communication, increases the ability for people to understand and track and monitor and all the things. What specifically about applying that data visualization to the area that you're targeting in medicine? Why is it specifically so beneficial here?
Absolutely. Well, just generally, 65% of us are visual learners. And so the idea of turning complex medical information into pictures allows majority of us to be able to access that, let alone the fact that less than 20% of us actually retain what we're reading and actually hearing from our clinicians, such as speech, occupational, and physical therapists. It is another medium to create a picture that everyone can actually discuss, decipher together, and figure out whether progress is being made or not.
But do you feel like there's a specific advantage in the area that you're in, or is the area that you're in simply your area of expertise, and so that's where you've started?
There's a specific advantage in general just to turning anything into visualizations. You know, the cheesy term, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Mm-hmm. But specifically within these areas, incremental progress is really hard to recognize. And it's those last little pieces to get us back to better post diagnosis that people really need to understand and celebrate, because otherwise that can mean going back to therapy or going back to surgery. So
and so the sort of obvious example, I don't know if it's obvious, but the example that pops into my head is speech recovery for a stroke, somebody who's had a stroke.
Absolutely.
So walk me through how the Smart Chart helps a stroke victim relative to, how would you compare a stroke victim who has the advantage of a Smart Chart versus someone who does not?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the biggest, side effects from having a stroke can often be the ability to interpret language. So the idea of being able to turn their progress into a picture that the patient as well as the caregivers and families can see, so that everyone's on the same page in terms of understanding how well they're doing. But a personal story that I can actually weave in is my mom actually had a stroke when I was 3 years old, and had to walk, talk, read, write again. And all of those little pieces were really hard to celebrate along the way, simply because they don't happen in big, huge leaps. They take little steps for us to actually get back to normal and recover. And it's been over 30 years, Dylan, and nothing has changed. And for me, I think that's kind of unfortunate, because I like to say that, speech, occupational, or physical therapy touches every single one of us in our lives. Whenever I'm speaking, I ask people, do you know somebody who's been in physical therapy? Do you know somebody who's been in speech? And if it's not ourselves, it's somebody around us. So personal mission, but also extremely important for all of us to be able to advocate for ourselves and understand what's happening when it's happening.
And who's your competition? I mean, obviously there's sort of the standardization of document prep and all the different things. There's all sorts of things that create visualization. I'm curious, what is the proprietary aspect of what you're doing in converting those charts into visualizations?
Love that question. So the current competition is the status quo. So you might know Epic or Cerner, the My Charts that we see. And those were basically ways to take medical records for discrete individual visits, there is nothing actually showing progress over time, particularly when it comes to a space that is so predicated on clinical specialty to help patients move forward. So in terms of what the alternative is now, it's a lot of jargon-rich notes in terms of when you're going to, here in Chicago, Shirley Ryan or Northwestern for rehab. So we are working to change that and work with those EMRs. And,
what's an EMR?
I apologize. Yes, it's electronic medical record. So that's
Okay.
where all of our health data is and where they kind of keep tabs on what we're doing and the notes behind our betterment process.
And the idea is to put a smart chart on top of most or on top of many electronic medical records, or to create continuity across time through electronic medical records, or both.
Absolutely, to connect those points in time in terms of progress, but create data interoperability between settings as well. So, going back to your stroke example, if you had a stroke, had to be in the actual acute care for a week, and then you were transitioning to outpatient and starting to go from home, you can actually watch that progression between those different settings, allowing that continuity of care. But that data interoperability is also pretty difficult. Right now, the system is open notes and open entry information, which is not really accessible to us.
Mm-hmm. And who's your customer? Where does your revenue live?
Absolutely. So in the current, we're about to launch an enterprise version next year. In our current customer base, we have small and medium-sized practices that are across the spectrum, serving children to adults. We will be moving into that direct.
But the customer is the physician themselves. The physician pays for smart charts, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's the provider. So it's whoever that organization is, that rehab organization or that private practice that you'd be going through. The tool is for the clinician and the organization themselves in terms of automating those notes, reducing communication time with the patients. But the idea is that the patient can actually access and celebrate what they're actually working on, as well as advocate when it isn't working. So it's a multidisciplinary kind of.
And where do you find the biggest resistance? I mean, again, better communication is one of those things where, I can't think of an industry that is more difficult to work with than the medical industry, because the incentives are so grossly misaligned, because obviously most profitability comes from keeping people in a severe chronic illness that doesn't kill them, which is the most profitable customer in the world. And a healthy customer is obviously disastrous for business. And so I'm curious how you reconcile all those misaligned incentives to try to find the right allies.
And it's actually interesting because it's kind of counterintuitive. If a hospital is if a patient is re-hospitalized into that type of setting, it's actually really expensive for insurance companies. And yes, the providers would make more money. However, that prolonged experience of never reaching an ultimate outcome impacts the entire system. It's flooding our system. You have patients that are continuously coming back, but those outcomes aren't there. So those reimbursement rates from the insurance companies don't necessarily align. So this, what I'm building with Smart Charts is a labor of multiple things. Before I was a speech language pathologist, I was an actuary. And I realized that there was so much data lost in the notes that were between sessions that could really fuel a change and allow us to actually see those differences based on individual characteristics, age, severity of diagnosis, different types of things like height, as well as, education level. So the goal here is really to fuel the data that we're already taking, but create a standardization and interoperability that will help every single one of us kind of use that data to our advantage, which also incentivizes the insurance companies and the providers, because patients aren't taxing the system and coming back in spaces that can be really expensive and just one-off type of visits.
And what is your vision for Smart Charts over the next 12 months?
Yes. So we're making that enterprise leap right now in terms of integrating to those larger electronic medical records. We're going to prove efficacy and outcome on both the patient and provider side, saving time, increasing outcomes and ultimate achievements for patients. And the real goal right now is we're fundraising to support those efforts. As you mentioned earlier, the medical industry in general is really hard to break into and to create change in. And we're looking to break those barriers, not only for the patient understanding, but to really just break into that market in general.
Is there an incentive that exists financially for either the insurance companies or the hospital companies that might make them easy to enroll in your product?
Yes, absolutely. So, from a productivity standpoint, our super user clinicians are gaining 75% on documentation time. So, what usually takes 8 to 12 minutes can take less than half of that in some instances. Aside from that, communication time is not something that we've been able to really quantify well across the hospital system. And by turning the progress into pictures, it allows doctors to surmise where a patient is very quickly across all areas for a stroke patient, as well as create communication channels with the caregivers and other therapists. That would be multiple calls, multiple minutes. And so we have an estimate of about 50%, but Northwestern Kellogg is going to help us actually dial those numbers in more.
Amazing. Corinne, it's a pleasure to meet you. Congratulations on your success.
Thank you so much, Dylan. Have a good day.
All right, Corinne Vargas, the name, Smart Charts, the company, bootstrapping, the segment, Tasty Live continues here right after this.